on pages 64, 65, 66, 67, so on and so forth. The Book of Mormon records, this is on page 64, the Book of Mormon records that Lehi, in obedience to the Lord's command, left Jerusalem with his family, and when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water, and it came to pass that he built an altar of stones and made an offering unto the Lord. This is 1 Nephi 2, verses 6 and 7. This simple act of worship raises an important issue for the reader familiar with biblical law. The Book of Mormon repeatedly assures us that the Nephites continued to live the law of Moses until the coming of Christ. That being the case, many readers are not surprised by Lehi's wilderness sacrifice, nor by other occasions when his people offered sacrifice and burnt offerings unto the Lord. We see that at 1 Nephi 5:9 and 7 verse 22. And they built a temple which presumably had an altar. Yet Deuteronomy chapter 12 appears to strictly forbid the building of altars and the making of sacrifice outside the place the Lord had chosen for that purpose. The place so designated is usually understood to be the temple in Jerusalem. So is this a contradiction of Deuteronomy chapter 12 in the Book of Mormon? How could these people who observed the Mosaic law justify building altars and offering sacrifices away from the Jerusalem temple? While there are several possible answers, the passage in the Book of Mormon that mentions Lehi's 3 days' journey into the wilderness may provide an explanation that is at once surprising and simple. Now, I'm going to bypass his discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 12 and the legitimacy of Lehi's altar and sacrifice and so on and so forth. He goes into some really very good, interesting discussions here. However, what I want to do is get to his main point. It is an extremely interesting point. On page 68, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Twice in the Temple Scroll of the Dead Sea Scroll, the expression 3 days' journey from the temple occurs in column 43:12 about the law of the tithe and column 52:14 concerning sacrifice. The most important passage for our study appears in column 52. Here's what it says. You shall not slaughter a clean ox or sheep or goat in all your towns near to my temple within a distance of a 3 days' journey. Nay, but inside my temple you shall slaughter it, making it a burnt offering or a peace offering. You shall eat and rejoice before me at the place with which I shall choose to put my name. That's the Dead Sea Temple Scroll. Now, the standard interpretation here, by Yigal Yadin and others, incidentally, of the phrase 3 days' journey in this passage is that the Temple Scroll prohibits all non-sacrificial slaughter within the boundaries of 3 days' distance from Jerusalem. Within this geographical boundary, the only permissible slaughter is sacrificial. In other words, the Temple Scroll bans all slaughter for non-sacrificial purposes, the so-called secular slaughter for human consumption. This, of course, would be a very restrictive injunction, of course. Recently, a scholar, Aaron Shemesh, has suggested a new interpretation of the phrase in question. This is a very interesting possibility here coming up. He has demonstrated from rabbinical sources that the actual distance of a 3-day journey from the Jerusalem temple would, for all practical purposes, mark a radius encompassing the whole land of Israel, since any points therein can be reached from the temple within that time frame. Shemesh suggests that the passage in column 52 of the Temple Scroll should be read as an interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, which is discussed in the Temple Scroll in the preceding passage in column 51. Those verses in Deuteronomy describe the manner of sacrifice in the land after the conquest and the destruction of the pagan altars. Shemesh concludes that the Temple Scroll interprets the whole of Deuteronomy 12 in light of its opening verse. On this basis, we can suggest that the author of the Temple Scroll embraced the opinion that the law of centralization of worship applied only in the land of Israel, in line with Deuteronomy 12:1, opening's declaration. These are the laws and rules that you must observe in the land. Very interesting here. This is on page 69 now. Shemesh cites several other examples from the rabbinic literature to show that some of the ancient rabbis did not condemn the temples, the altars, and the sacrifices in the Jewish temple of Onias in Egypt because they were outside of the land of Israel. So the same reasoning, the same method of interpreting Deuteronomy 12 may lie behind the Nephite justification for building a temple in the New World, even in the light of their continued obedience to the law of Moses. It is possible that they understood the injunction of Deuteronomy 12 concerning altars and sacrifices and temples to apply only to the land of Israel as suggested by Deuteronomy 12:1. So, in the temple scroll, we find an ancient interpretation of the centralization of worship in Deuteronomy that prohibits sacrifice within a 3 days journey of Jerusalem. Whether this passage is interpreted to mean that there should be no sacrificial slaughter in Israel except at the temple, or that secular slaughter was allowed in Israel, it is clear that an ancient interpretation limited the application of Deuteronomy 12 to a geographic area established by the distance of a 3 days journey from Jerusalem, an area that roughly coincided with the boundaries of Israel. Isn't that fascinating? So Nephi recorded of his father Lehi that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, that he built an altar of stones and made an offering unto the Lord and gave thanks unto the Lord our God. 1 Nephi 2:6 and 7. This statement may simply be due to the historical fact that Lehi and his family traveled for 3 days before they stopped for a significant rest. But the note on the 3 days journey may also be Nephi's way of saying that Lehi and his family were acting in accordance with an understanding of the law of Moses and with Deuteronomy chapter 12. That understanding is consistent with what we find preserved in the temple scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. According to that document, the building of an altar and the offering of sacrifice were allowed only outside the radius of a 3 days journey from the temple in Jerusalem. To put the matter differently, sacrifices beyond the 3-day limit were acceptable under the law of Moses. In this view, Lehi was conforming to the Mosaic requirement expressed in Deuteronomy 12 when he built an altar in the wilderness and offered sacrifice. Again, perfect consistency, not only with the records of antiquity, but with the way in which the religion and the history and the actual occurrences, their doings themselves, what they found and how they acted, is perfectly consistent in the Book of Mormon.